let's talk about Pete Hegseth and the Pentagon. I mean, what the hell's going on in the Pentagon?
So this is a lot. So a few things are happening at the same time. One, and I think this is noteworthy. One, I should caveat this by saying that religious expression in the U.S. military is not unusual. There's an entire chaplain corps. They are very active. The Pentagon has dedicated worship services long before Pete Hegseth got there.
Mm-hmm.
What Pete Hegseth has done has created his own worship service, and there are posters for it that say Sec War worship service, and Secretary War being how he describes himself. And that is a recurring event that happens monthly, it seems. And that is very unusual. Hegseth himself usually speaks at this. And the people he has come in to kind of give, sermons at these events have been overwhelmingly evangelical, if not exclusively. And we have not been privy to every one of these worship services, so I don't know everyone who has preached, but also disproportionately represented within that core of preachers who have shown up to these events. At least two of them have been members of the the Communion for Reformed Evangelical Churches, the CREC. That is the denomination that I mentioned Doug Wilson before. That is the one he co-founded. And so that both the pastor of a CREC church that Hegseth has been attending in Tennessee before he became Secretary of Defense has spoken. He spoke actually at the inaugural event, if I'm not mistaken. And Wilson himself has also spoken at one of these events. That is noteworthy. The CREC is not a very big denomination. It is a very small group. Doug Wilson has kind of emerged as this significant figure in conservative circles over the last few years, particularly in the aftermath of during the pandemic. Again, self-described Christian nationalist. He has argued that women, his argument is that households should vote as opposed to individuals. If a woman is single, she theoretically could vote, but if she is in a household, the understanding is that votes as a household with the man as the head of the household. He is taking a myriad.
Give me a second just to absorb that for a minute.
Yeah.
Is that being preached in the Pentagon? Is he saying that when he is in the Pentagon and having these services?
So Wilson did not preach that on the day that he addressed. We have footage of that. And I should explain, so that there was that church in Tennessee that Hegseth attended. There is now a worship service that is happening in the District of Columbia called Christ Church, DC. It's a little confusing because it is not actually a church. It is a worship service that is run by Christ Church in Idaho, which is Doug Wilson's church. And so it is a rotating band of preachers at that service. And in terms of who is there, and Hegseth is a regular attendee. I went to the inaugural service. I was present in the back of the pews when Hegseth was there. The opening argument from the pastor that day was worship is warfare. That's what the preacher said that day. And just to give you an idea of how important that is, when I was actually at the Pentagon yesterday, where they had a press conference, and Hegseth kicked off that press conference with some opening remarks that including him directly referencing a sermon from that worship service, in which he used it as an argument to refer to some members of the press as Pharisees. But that was the point of invoking that. But I bring that up just because this faith is playing a powerful role. So while I don't know if Doug Wilson is saying that specifically to Pete Hegseth, we do not know if Pete Hegseth specifically agrees with everything that Doug Wilson preaches. The influence of that tradition on Hegseth it appears to be, by Hegseth's own intimation, somewhat significant.
Jack, what does that mean for prosecuting a war against a Shia nation when he thinks prayer is warfare?
Worship is warfare.
Worship is warfare. So right. What does he think is going on? How does that influence? I don't know how to ask this question. If there's no war, if we're at peace, is he out of a job because he's a Secretary of War? So we have to have war, and we have to have war because worship requires us to worship in the same way, and these infidels on the other side of the planet don't, and so we have to be at war with them. I mean, does he think we're in a holy war?
So this is actually an interesting question, because I don't Because like your top line question of like how Secretary Hegseth makes sense of this war theologically is an open question.
Yeah.
And I think unlike previous eras of American history, I think it's a very live and important question, given the primacy that Secretary Hegseth himself has placed on his faith, right? Like it is common for him to begin these press conferences that are designed to give updates on the Iran war with direct appeals to his faith. And again, he's citing sermons that he has had preached to him. So it is very clear that from his perspective, and I should note, Pete Hegseth actually kind of went on an interesting religious journey to land in this space. He is not a longtime member of the CEREC. He's it came relatively later in his life that this has been an animating feature of his.
God made me good, but not yet.
Yeah. And so like, but I don't like I would love to sit down with Secretary Hegseth and hear how he theologically interprets this. And it's not even clear, who his immediate conversation partners are with that theology, right? If he is talking to Doug Wilson every day, if he's talking to other people, but it is the reason I'm saying it's a long-winded way of saying I too have significant questions about whether or not how he's interpreting this, because he certainly seems to be invoking, prayers that in one of them, which says, because one of the prayers he's led at one of these worship services included the line, we should, I'm paraphrasing a little bit here, but we should have military action against people who deserve no mercy. That is a term, right? And that is a profound theological statement to make, that there are human beings that deserve no mercy. And again, he was reading a prayer for someone else, but he decided to read that prayer. And I have lots of questions about how that animates his own theology.
I do too. And what faith tradition it comes from. I mean, it's so bizarre to have this conversation about the executive branch of the United States of America, where there is supposed to be a separation of church and state. And there actually has been one for most of our history. But like, is there an orthodoxy among the administration's faithful, or are there competing theologies in this group that's controlling the religious dialogue in the White House? I know it's a bizarre, crazy question to ask, but it looks like there's a faith war going on inside the White House, and it has consequences for all of us in the country.
No, I think one of the more interesting developments of this second administration is that there are competing theologies, right? So Doug Wilson, who I've talked a lot about, was openly critical of the idea of placing Paula White as head of the White House Faith Office. He had a bit of a nuance on that. He was like, well, essentially arguing that if the office doesn't matter that much, then like whatever. But the implication, this is my interpretation, is that of his argument was that if it matters, then I would not like that. Now you have to remember he opposes women's ordination, full stop, right?
Right. I'm sure he'd be happy with her husband having the job. But
there's that dynamic. But this is an interesting rift because Trump has surrounded himself with a very specific subset of evangelical pastors during his rise to power. They were interesting in part because they were reflective more of the charismatic Pentecostal tradition of evangelicalism, which, while not absent from politicized evangelicalism, were not disproportionately represented. It's actually really interesting that they have become very politically involved. And so, whereas the kind of Doug Wilson verse, for lack of a better term, the expanding influence of that world within the administration does seem to be directly at odds with the kind of Paula White verse, as it were, in terms of many nuances. Now, as a political reality, I'm not sure there would be a ton of it would be a distinction without a difference, for instance, for who they might see as their political opponents. But it is, doesn't seem to be a single operating theology so much as there is now I'm doing a little oversimplification by even making it two camps, but these are two very powerful religious camps in the Trump administration that do not necessarily see eye to eye at all.
Is there, over history, religious religions have had theology, doctors of theology, a great deal of ink spilled about what the religion actually believes, what it means. Does that exist for these two groups? Or is it more of pastor-led in the moment kind of thing?
Well, So evangelicalism in general, right, often has a more congregationalist, non-denominational bent, right? You find it more often in those spaces than others. And so by design, a lot of, if you have a more congregationalist tradition, more power is vested in the individual pastor than in the collective, right? And which has been interesting because that tradition has also done a very good job of building a political bloc, right? Which is kind of the contrary to that. But the Doug Wilson, one, belongs to a denomination he helped co-found, and also seems to kind of have influence beyond just that denomination, right? There are, as many sources I've spoken with have told me for years, Doug Wilson isn't just this figure within evangelicalism in terms of like what he is preaching on Sunday. He also was disproportionately involved in popularizing what's called the classical Christian education movement, which is this very specific group of schools that kind of K through 12 students are educated in. I should note that according to Pete Hegseth, he moved to Tennessee specifically to enroll his children in a classical Christian education school, right? So his influence kind of expands beyond just Christ Church, Moscow, Idaho. He actually has a much broader influence on a very specific understanding of education as well. He does have a denomination, and so is traditionally beholden to that, but it is a very small one. Meanwhile, Paula White, this is kind of charismatic Christianity. It often operates in networks, not denominations, and so she has a very influential group of friends and allies, and they have major events and what have you. But in terms of like, there's no like central council within her tradition that's agreeing on theological norms.
It's fascinating to me intellectually and frightening I put my faith in democracy, and I understand that when it comes to religion, Americans have many faiths. But it sounds like if some of these faiths say women can't vote, for example, or can't vote if they're married, they run contrary to the kind of democracy we have. And that's a tension for sure. And a very difficult one for a democracy to deal with.
Right. I mean, some of these folks actively challenge what they argue is an aberration of, and this is me speaking in the general, what they argue is an aberration of what they see was the founding, right? They think that America has departed from the ways of its founding, right?
It has. We don't do slavery anymore. We let women vote. There are a lot of ways where in 200 and some years we have grown.
Well, I mean,
we don't go to war with muskets. I mean, there are a lot of things that we don't do that we did way back when.